blockchain is any system that places trust in a group of entities rather than a single entity to function. So if you're looking at, for example, Bitcoin, you're placing trust in the collective of miners rather than having like a single payment processor. And not all of these entities, by the way, need to be honest. And the reason behind this is that you can have some entities that are looking out for their own economic self-interest. You can even have others that are actively trying to subvert the system. But the system will continue to work. And one core way this happens is you have many of these entities participating, so that if any small subset of them are taken down or caused to behave maliciously, the system will continue to work. And this notion is what we call decentralization. So decentralization is a very big buzzword that's used in blockchains. However, if we want to actually seriously improve the state of decentralization in blockchains, we have to do two things. One, we have to measure where we are today. And the second is we have to use that information in order to design tomorrow's blockchains and see what they should look like in the future. So how do we measure decentralization? So here I'm going to focus on, again, the network layer decentralization. And we use three techniques to get at this core concept of decentralization. We first directly measured nodes in each network. And by each network, I'm talking about Bitcoin and Ethereum, the two most popular blockchain networks. And we also looked at the actual blockchain state itself. And we also built and deployed the Falcon relay network in order to get pruned Bitcoin blocks. So what did we do? We connected to over 3,000 Bitcoin nodes and 4,000 Ethereum nodes. And we did this for over a year. And we collected about 4 gigabytes of raw network data that we analyzed. We also built and operated a full-scale relay network for Bitcoin. We're the first relay network in Bitcoin to use cut-through routing to deliver blocks quickly. And this technique actually incentivizes miners to connect to us directly. And what this means is we get access to blocks as they're mined, and we can actually get a look at pruned blocks in Bitcoin that aren't visible if you just run like a full node. So we look at 5 research questions. The first one is how much bandwidth is available in the network. The second is the core issue of decentralization, which is how physically decentralized are these nodes. The third question is looking at the mining level of decentralization. And then we look at the evolution of mining by asking if the protocol is fair to small miners, or if there's an incentive to coalesce. And then finally, we look at how efficiently the mining power itself is being used. So the first question we look at is the available bandwidth. This is the peak available bandwidth available to a particular node. And this limits the resources that are available to the system. So we need to determine key system parameters through measurement. And the bandwidth is actually a central issue in the whole block size debate. So if we look at Bitcoin and Ethereum, on the x-axis we have the amount of bandwidth of a particular node, and on the y-axis it's the percent of nodes that have at most that much bandwidth. So the more shifted to your right this is, the more bandwidth a particular network has. I think the most interesting aspect of this graph is if you look at the Bitcoin network, which is this blue line right here, and the Ethereum network, which is the red line. Ethereum has less bandwidth available to it than Bitcoin, but is pushing more transactions per second. And this actually means Ethereum is using its available resources much more efficiently than Bitcoin is. We also need to look at the evolution of available bandwidth over time. So if we look at the bandwidth in 2016 versus 2017, the bandwidth in the Bitcoin network increased by a factor of 1.7. What this means is if you are happy with the level of decentralization in 2016, and your claim is that Bitcoin is decentralized in 2016, you should be able to increase the bandwidth requirements by a factor of 1.7, and you'll still be happy with the level of decentralization in 2017. And this really speaks to how you should go about designing these cryptocurrency networks and deciding on key system parameters through measurement. The next thing we look at is the key issue behind decentralization, which is how physically decentralized are these nodes? And we want to measure the distance between two nodes. So again, on the x-axis is we have the estimated ping latency between two arbitrary nodes in the Bitcoin and Ethereum network, and on the y-axis we have a percentage of nodes that have that latency.
Quick question: are the nodes just minor nodes? Or
No, they're all nodes. A good question. But yeah, so I think the key takeaway here is that Ethereum is more physically decentralized than Bitcoin is. So because we see a higher latency. We dug into why this could potentially be the case, and we actually saw that most of the nodes in the Bitcoin network actually are part of electronic systems that are part of data centers. So over 50% of Bitcoin nodes seem like they're probably even part of a data center, whereas in Ethereum that same number is about a quarter. So the next thing is we saw how physically decentralized the nodes are. We saw how much bandwidth they have. Now we want to look at the decentralization in the consensus layer. And this is the mining power distribution. And this is how much does each miner contribute? How much say does each miner have in what actually appears on the blockchain? And here we can just get the data from the Bitcoin and Ethereum blockchains itself, because miners self-identify which blocks they mine. So if we look at the mining power distribution, this is sorted according to how powerful each miner is. It's basically an exponential curve. I think a more useful view is actually this one, which talks about how many miners does it take to get to a certain percentage of hash power in Bitcoin and Ethereum. And we actually see that in Bitcoin it takes 4 miners to get to a 51% attack. In Ethereum you only have to talk to 3. So we see that, and again, if you want to control almost all the hash power, like 90% of the hash power in Bitcoin and Ethereum, you only need to talk to 16 entities in Bitcoin and 11 in Ethereum. And suppose instead, if the top 20 miners decided we're just going to run a permissioned chain, that would actually be more decentralized than what Bitcoin and Ethereum are today. And what this really says, I'm not advocating for the permission solution, of course, but what this really says is that more research is necessary for better protocols, such as the switch to proof of stake we're seeing in Ethereum. And now we want to see actually what the evolution of that will look like over time, and see if there's actually an incentive towards being a large miner. And we get at this question through the notion of fairness. So if a miner has about 10% of the blocks on the main chain, then if we look at the blocks that didn't make it on the main chain, they should also have about 10% of those. And if they're overrepresented in one or the other, then they either get an unfair amount of say or not enough say in what's actually happening on the blockchain. So here, a fairness of 1 is ideal, and the higher the number is, the more unfair it is for the miner. So if you look at Bitcoin and Ethereum, in Ethereum the ratio is close to 1 for all miners across the top 20. In Bitcoin we see a slightly different story. For some miners are doing pretty well. So for example, Hive BTC is doing pretty darn well, whereas for example a pool like Backpool is getting many more of their blocks pruned than they should be. But actually, if we take this data and examine it statistically, we see that the mean fairness is not actually different, is significantly different from 1 for both Bitcoin and Ethereum. But the variance is much higher in Bitcoin. We see some miners doing very well and some doing very poorly. And we can see this actually due to the block frequency. If we have a 1% miner in Bitcoin and Ethereum, they mine about 1.5 blocks per day in Bitcoin and about 72 blocks on Ethereum. So if a small miner's block gets pruned in each system, in Ethereum they have 71 more chances. Whereas in Bitcoin, that might have been the only block they found that day. So it hurts, so this variance of block rewards actually hurts smaller miners more disproportionately than larger miners. Okay, so the last thing that we measure is the fraction of blocks that get incorporated onto the main chain. So if I mine a block, I want as many of them to be included in the main chains as we can possibly get. And a lower mining power utilization, the more blocks that don't make it on the main chain, the lower the security and performance is of both of the system. And blocks are lost through pruned blocks in Bitcoin and uncle blocks in Ethereum. They're just different terminologies and they have slightly different semantics, but they're fundamentally the same. So in Bitcoin, we see over 99% of the blocks that get mined make it on the main chain. And in Ethereum, that number on average is about 94%. So some of these large dips are various attacks. So for example, this particular dip is the DAO hard fork, which is a time of commotion in the Ethereum network. So the takeaway here is that improving throughput from 3 transactions per second to 10 transactions per second increases the orphan rate from less than 1% to 6%. Now, we came here because, and we're here because blockchain has the potential to revolutionize many industries. 10 transactions per second is really not enough. We need at minimum a Visa scale, 2,000 to 3,000 transactions per second, if not more than that. So we go back and we revisit the fundamentals to see why are these forks happening. So if we look at these 2 miners and they all agree on the first 3 blocks, and these miners are mining away. If eventually someone, say miner 1, will find a block. Suppose that block now takes forever to get to miner 2, right? A really long time. Miner 2 will mine a block in the exact same spot as miner 1. And now you have a fork. So one of these forks will get built on, say it was miner 1 who got lucky this time. So that will become the main state, the global state, and miner 2's block will get pruned. And this fundamentally is why you have a lower mining power utilization. Because Ethereum is running its network at a higher capacity than Bitcoin is, so it has more of these pruned blocks. So this actually brings us to the core problem here, which is the timely data problem. And timely information is crucial for blockchains. And then this is for both, for all kinds. So a small communication delay will have a fork in Nakamoto consensus. Large communication delays will have large chain reorgs. So how bloXroute fits is bloXroute aims to solve the timely data problem by providing an efficient global broadcast primitive. So if we look at why this is so slow, and we dive into a network, when a miner mines a block, it first slowly sends it to its peers. Then the peers will wait until they have received the full block. And once they've received the full block, they're going to start forwarding it to their peers. So this process will take a long time for a block to propagate, and more of these forks will happen. So a strawman solution here is to just centralize the network. So say we use something like AWS to propagate all the blocks and transactions. Now, if we do that, then AWS gets to decide which blocks and transactions make it and which ones don't, because they can just drop the blocks they don't like. So we kind of lose the point if we just centralize the network. So what bloXroute does is it gives you the benefit of having a centrally managed network, and it keeps the peer-to-peer network around to check to make sure that the central network is behaving correctly. So if bloXroute misbehaves, the peer-to-peer network will move away automatically. So we make it faster by using 2 techniques. The first one is when a miner mines a block, it compresses it and makes it a lot smaller. And then when the block gets to a bloXroute server, it forwards it on immediately to all other bloXroute servers. In this way, if people are connected to us, they will actually receive the blocks much more quickly than they would in the regular peer-to-peer propagation. So what are the benefits? This solves scalability. So we can use every network optimization in the book to try and get things to scale, but just these two techniques, compression and cut-through routing, is enough to close the gap between Visa and permissionless cryptocurrencies and get to thousands of transactions per second.
Portals would be way too diminished.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I think you're kind of ahead of me here, which is we now get a better decentralization as well. Once any consensus protocol scales up to more than a couple dozen miners, it gets pretty complicated at the network layer because you need to send to many other nodes. So having bloXroute manage your network will actually allow you to scale to many, many more nodes than you would otherwise. And finally, bloXroute is being architected in a way that it's one solution for all chains. So there's just a conversion between the bloXroute API and the other chain's API. And in this way, you can actually, any improvements to bloXroute performance will help the whole cryptocurrency space in general. And this is in stark contrast to the approach that's taken today, where, for example, Bitcoin